Moving on to the next topic though, man. It's music news. I'm moving away from the Oscars. I'm moving away from music. And I'm discussing my favourite band of all time, the Beatles, and one throwaway quote that's probably about 50 years old now. John Lennon mentioned during, I think, perhaps his long weekend, is that what you called it? The long, I can't remember. It was a period where he disappeared, did his own thing for a year. Buggered off to LA and had some parties with the likes of Keith Moon, I think, and Ringo Starr, and probably David Bowie. Certainly met Paul McCartney at one point. And yeah, he was a free bird until he came back to Yoko. And yeah, I've asked the question here, did John Lennon and Paul McCartney make the Beatles great? It's a bit of a rhetorical question really, because there is only one answer. Yes, they did. If I'm being honest, they did make the Beatles great. They made up a large part of the songwriting process for the vast majority of the Beatles' discography. All of the greatest songs came from their minds, apart from perhaps something. Maybe My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun. Everything else was really Lennon and McCartney. So of course they made the Beatles great. They were the driving creative force in the band. But to sort of jump off of that, use that as a springboard and maybe answer this question, that Lennon kind of proposes to the universe again, probably about 50 years ago, because he's been dead for about 40 odd. He suggested he and Paul McCartney could have been the Beatles without George Harrison and Ringo Starr. I've says, did they make the Beatles great? It doesn't really connect. It's a bit strange. I'll get into it. I'll read the quotes and then I'll get into it. I just found this interesting. I've probably heard this some 50 times before, having watched the likes of the anthology. But I just found it interesting. I thought, I'll fling this in and have a little discussion about the Beatles. After my sort of rant about Oscars so male. What the fuck? Even now it perplexes me, it really does. This is what I had to say. Let's say I think it's possible for John and Paul to have created the same thing with two other guys. It may not have been possible for George and Ringo to have created it without John and Paul. Okay. He then goes on to say, but that doesn't take away from the individual talents that they have. Ringo was a star in his own right in Liverpool before we even met. Ringo was a professional drummer who sang and performed and was in one of the top groups in Britain. But especially in Liverpool, so Ringo's talent would have come out one way or the other, and you can see that. This man got a number one in the United States. This is the fucking drummer of the Beatles. Got a number one in the United States. So, obviously a very talented guy in his own right. And I think this is going on to say, perhaps, no, he's not talking about George. I think he hated George at this point, to be fair, John. There was a lot of bad blood, so maybe he didn't even mention him. But he's continued, I don't know what he would have ended up as, whatever that spark is in Ringo. We all know it, but we can't put a finger on it. Whether it's acting, drumming or singing, I don't know. There's something in him that is projectable, and he would have surfaced as an individual. And I think that's the key here, realistically. In terms of answering that question, could the Beatles have been the Beatles without George and Ringo if it was just John and Macca and two other individuals who were perhaps not as noteworthy or overall talented as the aforementioned Harrison and Starkey? I think that's the key to that question, the key to that sort of scenario proposed by John. They're all individual talents. They would have all made it in their own way, one way or the other. John would have been a success. He was an absolute genius of an individual. Macca would have been a success, an absolute genius of a musician, melodist, songwriter. Harrison was a shy, more introverted guy initially, but I'm pretty sure as he grew as a human, he would have been successful in some artistic way. It was there within him, innate. And as John eloquently put it regarding Ringo, he had that something special, that X factor that would have made itself known individually at some point in his life. Would they have been able to be the Beatles though without those two? I think they could have, in the end, for all the reasons I mentioned like 2-3 minutes ago. The overwhelming majority of creative brainstorming was Lennon McCartney. The music was Lennon McCartney. The lyrics, the structures they were creating, Lennon and McCartney. You could have brought in a guitarist equally as talented as George Harrison. He could have fitted in there and played the guitar parts. And George wasn't really doing a huge amount of sort of individual song work in the first 4 or 5 years of the Beatles, 3-4 years of the Beatles, so he wouldn't have been missed in that regard. Obviously, as a backing singer, a vocalist, actually an unsung hero in some of those songs. Some of his harmonies are stunning, but he could have been replaced. He was replaceable. Getting into the later days, it's a tougher question. Ringo certainly could have been replaced and was replaced at parts of the Beatles' journey. They went to Australia and they had a fucking session musician playing live tours without Ringo. He had tonsillitis, he got it removed. So I think the question is, yes, they could have been the Beatles, but would it have been the same Beatles we loved and still appreciate all these years later? That's a different question. Probably not, because individually they all had something to bring to the table. Individually, their personalities, it seemed to be lightning in a bottle. That's where the magic happened. They all bestowed us with something special. I always say, and you could probably say this for any musical act, musician, band, but there's something about the Beatles, man. You split them individually, their sounds, sonically, you can pick the song out just by hearing the rhythm guitar, the lead guitar, the bass, the drums. You bring it all together, the magic truly happens. That's why I'm really enjoying what Giles Martin is doing just now. Martin, I should say, is doing just now with these remasters. He is using the Peter Jackson software. The sort of, I'm trying to think what the name of the software. I'll never get it. It doesn't matter. But he's using that sort of incredible AI sort of fueled software to remix these songs and present them to us the way they would have been heard if you were sitting in Studio 2 while they were being recorded. And that's when all the brilliance, individual brilliance of these four guys comes out. And you can hear the bass, you can hear the rhythm guitar, you can hear the drums, you can hear the lead, you can hear the vocals, and they're all distinct and they're separated. That's when you realise what they all brought to the table. But yes, they could have absolutely have been the Beatles without those two, because John Lennon and Paul McCartney were, and ultimately, if I can speak, what made the Beatles truly great for the vast majority of our discography. George became fucking great. Ringo was always a fantastic drummer, underrated, but it's Lennon and McCartney. They are the Beatles, and that's why it's not really a controversial statement. And I don't really know why I'm talking about this realistically, because it's, as I say, it's a rhetorical question. Of course, it made them great, and of course, they could have survived in some vein without those two. It just wouldn't have been the same.